Step into the profound and poignant world of Clive Staples Lewis with A Grief Observed, a heartfelt reflection on the loss of his beloved wife, Joy Davidman. This powerful narrative captures Lewis's journey through the shadows of grief, from the depths of despair to the quest for understanding and solace in his faith. Join us as Lewis shares his intimate thoughts and emotions, grappling with the pain of loss and the nature of memory. He recounts a poignant encounter with an acquaintance after 10 years, which sparks a fear that his memories of joy might also fade or alter over time. This realization leads him to ponder the fragility of our recollections and the impact of time on our perceptions of those we love. Lewis uses the metaphor of small shadows to describe how his choices and emotions gradually obscure his memories of joy, highlighting his fear that a single moment of reality could shatter his cherished recollections. He wrestles with the difference between reality and memory, confronting the potential distortion of his mental images of joy. Amidst his sorrow, Lewis also contemplates the happiness that Joy has found beyond her earthly struggles, and reflects on his own fluctuating faith and doubts about God's existence and the purpose of pain. This introduction to A Grief Observed delves into Lewis's profound insights on love, loss, memory, and faith, inviting viewers to witness his heartfelt struggle to maintain the true essence of his memories while seeking comfort and meaning in his spiritual beliefs. Discover how Lewis navigates his path to recovery, embracing time and acceptance as crucial elements in healing and moving forward in life.
Chapter 2. For the first time, I have looked back and read these notes. They appall me. From the way I've been talking, anyone would think that A's death mattered chiefly for its effect on myself. Her point of view seems to have dropped out of sight. Have I forgotten the moment of bitterness when she cried out? And there was so much to live for? Happiness had not come to her early in life. 1,000 years of it would not have made her blaze. Her palate for all the joys of sense and intellect and spirit was fresh and unspoiled. Nothing would have been wasted on her. She liked more things and liked them more than anyone I have known. A noble hunger, long unsatisfied, met at last its proper food, and almost instantly the food was snatched away. Fate, or whatever it is, delights to produce a great capacity and then frustrate it. Beethoven went deaf. By our standards, a mean joke. The monkey trick of a spiteful imbecile. I must think more about H and less about myself. Yes, that sounds very well, but there's a snag. I am thinking about her nearly always, thinking of the H, facts, real words, looks, laughs, and actions of hers. But it is my own mind that selects and groups them. Already less than a month after her death, I can feel the slow, insidious beginning of a process that will make the H I think of into a more and more imaginary woman. Founded on fact, no doubt, I shall put in nothing fictitious, or I hope I shan't. But won't the composition inevitably become more and more my own? The reality is no longer there to check me, to pull me up short as the real age so often did, so unexpectedly, by being so thoroughly herself and not me. The most precious gift that marriage gave me was the constant impact of something very close and intimate, yet all the time, unmistakably other, resistant, in a word, real. Is all that work to be undone? Is what I shall still call H to sink back horribly into being not much more than one of my old bachelor pipe dreams? Oh, my dear, come back for one moment and drive that miserable phantom away. Oh, God, why did you take such trouble to force this creature out of its shell if it is now doomed to crawl back, to be sucked back into it? Today, I had to meet a man I haven't seen for 10 years, and all that time I had thought I was remembering him well, how he looked and spoke, and the sort of things he said. The first 5 minutes of the real man shattered the image completely. Not that he had changed. On the contrary, I kept on thinking, yes, of course. I'd forgotten that he thought that, or disliked this, or knew so-and-so, or jerked his head back that way. I had known all these things once, and I recognized them that moment I met them again. But they had all faded out of my mental picture of him. And when they were all replaced by his actual presence, the total effect was quite astonishingly different from the image I had carried about with me for those 10 years. How can I hope that this will not happen to my memory of H, that it's not happening already? Slowly, quietly, like snowflakes, like the small flakes that come when it is going to snow all night. Little flakes of me, my impressions, my selections, are settling down on the image of her. The real shape will be quite hidden in the end. 10 minutes, 10 seconds of the real H would correct all this. And yet, even if those 10 seconds were allowed me, 1 second later, the little flakes would begin to fall again. The rough, sharp, cleansing tang of the otherness is gone. What pitiable, can't to say. She will live forever in my memory. Live? That is exactly what she won't do. You might as well think like the old Egyptians, that you can keep the dead by embalming them. Will nothing persuade us that they are gone? What's left? A corpse? A memory? In some versions, a ghost? All mockeries or horrors. 3 more ways of spelling the word dead. It was H I loved. As if I wanted to fall in love with my memory of her, an image in my own mind. I would be a sort of incest. It would be a sort of incest. I remember being rather horrified one summer morning long ago, when a burly, cheerful laboring man carrying a hoe in a watering pot came into our churchyard, and as he pulled the gate behind him, shouted over his shoulder to 2 friends, "See you later. I'm just going to visit Mom." He meant he was going to weed and water and generally tidy up her grave. It horrified me because this mode of sentiment, all this churchyard stuff was and is simply hateful, even inconceivable to me. But in the light of my recent thoughts, I am beginning to wonder whether if one could take that man's line, I can't. There isn't a good deal to be said for it. A 6 by 3 foot flower bed had become Mum. That was his symbol for her, his link with her. Caring for it was visiting her. May this not be in one way better than preserving and caressing an image in one's own memory? The grave and the image are equally links with the irrecoverable and symbols for the unimaginable, but the image has the added disadvantage that it will do whatever you want. It will smile or frown, be tender, gay, ribald, or argumentative, just as your mood demands. It is a puppet of which you hold the strings. Not yet, of course. The reality is still too fresh. Genuine and wholly involuntary memories can still, thank God, at any moment, rush in and tear the strings out of my hands. But the fatal obedience of the image, its insipid dependence on me, is bound to increase. The flower bed, on the other hand, is an obstinate, resistant, often intractable bit of reality. Just as Mom in her lifetime doubtless was, as H was, or as H is. Can I honestly say that I believe she now is anything? The vast majority of people I meet, say at work, would certainly think she is not. Though naturally, they wouldn't press the point on me, not just now anyway. What do I really think? I have always been able to pray for the other dead, and still do, with some confidence. But when I try to pray for H, I halt. Bewilderment and amazement come over me. I have a ghastly sense of unreality, of speaking into a vacuum about non-entity. The reason for the difference is only too plain. You never know how much you really believe anything until its truth or falsehood becomes a matter of life and death to you. It is easy to say you believe a rope to be strong and sound, as long as you are merely using it to cord a box. But suppose you had to hang by that rope over a precipice, wouldn't you then first discover how much you really trusted it? The same with people. For years, I would have said that I had perfect confidence in BR. Then came the moment when I had to decide whether I would or would not trust him with a really important secret. That threw quite a new light on what I called my confidence in him. I discovered that there was no such thing. Only a real risk tests the reality of a belief. Apparently, the faith, I thought it faith, which enables me to pray for the other dead, as seems strong only because I have never really cared, not desperately, whether they existed or not. Yet I thought I did. But there are other difficulties. Where is she now? That is, in what place is she at the present time? But if H is not a body, and the body I loved is certainly no longer she is in no place at all, and the present time is a dated point in our time series. It is as if she were on a journey without me. And I said, looking at my watch, I wonder if she is at Houston now. But useless, excuse me. But unless she is proceeding at 60 seconds a minute along this same timeline that all we living people travel by, what does now mean? If the dead are not in time or not in our sort of time, is there any clear difference when we speak of them between was and is and will be? Kind people have said to me, she is with God. In one sense, that is most certain. She is, like God, incomprehensible and unimaginable. But I find that this question, however important it may be in itself, is not after all very important in relation to grief. Suppose that she earthly excuse me. Suppose that the earthly lives she and I shared for a few years are in reality only the basis for, or prelude to, or earthly appearance of, to unimaginable, supercosmic, eternal somethings. Those somethings could be pictured as spheres or globes where the plane of nature cuts through them. That is, in earthly life, they appear as two circles. Circles are slices of spheres, two circles that touched, but those two circles above all the point at which they touched are the very thing I am mourning for, homesick for, famished for. You tell me, she goes on, but my heart and body are crying out, come back, come back. Be a circle touching my circle on the plane of nature, but I know this is impossible. I know that the thing I want is exactly the thing I can never get. The old life, the jokes, the drinks, the arguments, the lovemaking, the tiny heartbreaking commonplace. On any view, whatever to say, H is dead, is to say, all that is gone. It is a part of the past, and the past is the past, and that is what time means. And time itself is one more name for death, and heaven itself is a state where the former things have passed away. Talk to me about the truth of religion, and I'll listen gladly. Talk to me about the duty of religion, and I'll listen submissively. But don't come talking to me about the consolations of religion, or I shall suspect that you don't understand. Unless, of course, you can literally believe all that stuff about family reunions on the further shore, pictured in entirely earthly terms. But that is all unscriptural, all out of bad hymns and lithographs. There's not a word of it in the Bible, and it rings false. We know it couldn't be like that. Reality never repeats. The exact same thing is never taken away and given back. How well the spiritualists bait their hook. Things on this side are not so different from after all. There are cigars in heaven, for that is what we should all like, the happy past restored. And that, just that, is what I cry out for, with mad midnight endearments and entreaties spoken into the empty air. And poor seed quotes to me, do not mourn like those that have no hope. It astonishes me the way we are invited to apply to ourselves words so obviously addressed to our betters. What St. Paul says can comfort only those who love God better than the dead, and the dead better than themselves. If a mother is mourning, not for what she has lost, but for what her dead child has lost, it is a comfort to believe that the child has not lost the end for which it was created. And it is a comfort to believe that she herself, in losing her chief or only natural happiness, has not lost a greater thing, that she may still hope to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. A comfort to the God-aimed eternal spirit within her, but not to her motherhood. The specifically maternal happiness must be written off. Never in any place or time will she have her son on her knees, or bathe him, or tell him a story, or plan for his future, or see her grandchild. They tell me H is happy now. They tell me she is at peace. What makes them so sure of this? I don't mean that I fear the worst of all. Nearly her last words were, I am at peace with God. She had not always been, and she never lied, and she wasn't easily deceived, least of all in her own favor. I don't mean that. But why are they so sure that all anguish ends with death? More than half the Christian world and millions in the East believe otherwise. How do they know she is at rest? Why shouldn't the separation, if nothing else, which so agonizes the lover who is left behind, be painless to the lover who departs? Because she is in God's hands. But if so, she was in God's hands all the time, and I have seen what they did to her here. Do they suddenly become gentler to us the moment we are out of the body? And if so, why? If God's goodness is inconsistent with hurting us, then either God is not good or there is no God. For if the only life we know, He hurts us beyond our worst fears and beyond all we can imagine, if it is consistent with hurting us, then He may hurt us after death as unendurably as before it. Sometimes it is hard not to say, God, forgive God. Sometimes it is hard to say so much. But if our faith is true, He didn't. He crucified Him. Come, what do we gain by evasions? We are under the harrow and can't escape. Reality looked at steadily as unbearable, and how or why did such a reality blossom or fester here and there into the terrible phenomenon called consciousness? Why did it produce things like us who can see it and seeing it recoil in loathing? Who, stranger still, want to see it, and take pains to find it out, even when no need compels them. And even though the sight of it makes an incurable ulcer in their hearts, people like H herself who would have truth at any price. If H is not, then she never was. I mistook a cloud of atoms for a person. There aren't and never were any people. Death only reveals the vacuity that was always there. What we call the living are simply those who have not yet been unmasked, all equally bankrupt, but some not yet declared. But this must be nonsense. Vacuity revealed to whom? Bankruptcy declared to whom? To other boxes of fireworks or clouds of atoms? I will never believe, more strictly I can't believe, that one set of physical events could be or make a mistake about other sets. No, my real fear is not of materialism. If it were true, we or what we mistake for we could get from under the harrow. An overdose of sleeping pills would do it. I am more afraid that we are really rats in a trap, or worse still, rats in a labor laboratory. Someone said, I believe God always geometrizes, supposing the truth were God always vivisects. Sooner or later, I must face the question in plain language. What reason have we accept our own desperate wishes to believe that God is by any standard we can conceive good? Doesn't all the evidence suggest exactly the opposite? What have we to set against it? We see Christ against it. But how if he were mistaken? Almost his last words may have perfectly clear meaning. He had found that the being he called Father was horribly and infinitely different from what he had supposed. The trap, so long and carefully prepared and so subtly baited, was at last sprung on the cross. The vile practical joke had succeeded. What chokes every prayer and every hope is the memory of all the prayers H and I offered and all the false hopes we had. Not hopes raised merely by our own wishful thinking, hopes encouraged, even forced upon us by false diagnosis, by X-ray photographs, by strange remissions, by one temporary recovery that might have ranked as a miracle. Step by step, we were led up the garden path. Time after time, when he seems most gracious, he was really preparing the next torture. I wrote that last night. It was a yell rather than a thought. Let me try it over again. Is it rational to believe in a bad God? Anyway, in a God so bad as all that? The cosmic sadist? The spiteful imbecile? I think it is, if nothing else, too anthropomorphic. When you come to think of it, it is far more anthropomorphic than picturing him as a grave old king with a long beard. That image is a Jungian archetype. It links God with all the wise old kings in the fairy tales, with prophets, sages, magicians. Though it is formally the picture of a man, it suggests something more than humanity. At the very least, it gets in the idea of something older than yourself, something that knows more, something you can't fathom. It preserves mystery, therefore room for hope, therefore room for a dread or awe that needn't be mere fear of mischief from a spiteful potentate. But the picture I was building up last night is simply the picture of a man like SC, who used to sit next to me at dinner and tell me what he'd been doing to the cats that afternoon. Now, a being like SC, however magnified, couldn't invent or create or govern anything. He would set traps and try to bait them, but he'd never have thought of baits like love or laughter or daffodils or a frosty sunset. He make a universe? He couldn't make a joke or a bow or an apology or a friend. Or could one seriously introduce the idea of a bad God as if it were by the back door through a sort of extreme Calvinism? You could say we are fallen and depraved. We are so depraved that our ideas of goodness count for nothing, or worse than nothing. The very fact that we think something good is presumptive evidence that it is really bad. Now, God has in fact our worst fears are true. All the characteristics we regard as bad. Unreasonableness, vanity, vindictiveness, injustice, cruelty. But all these blacks as they seem to us are really whites. It's only our depravity that makes them look black to us. And so what? This, for all practical and speculative purposes, Sponges got off the slate. The word good applied to him becomes meaningless, like abracadabra. We have no motive for obeying him, not even fear. It is true we have his threats and promises, but why should we believe them if cruelty is from his point of view good? Telling lies may be good too. Even if they are true, what then? If his ideas of good are so very different from ours, what he calls heaven might well be what we should call hell, and vice versa. Finally, if reality at its very root is so meaningless to us, or putting it the other way around, If we are such total imbeciles, what is the point of trying to think either about God or about anything else? This knot comes undone when you try to pull it tight. Why do I make room in my mind for such filth and nonsense? Do I hope that if feeling disguises itself as though I should feel less? Aren't all these notes in the senseless writings of a man who won't accept the fact that there is nothing we can do with suffering except to suffer it? Who still thinks there is some device, if only he could find it, which will make pain not to be pain? It doesn't really matter whether you grip the arms of the dentist chair or let your hands lie in your lap. The drill drills on, and grief still feels like fear. Perhaps more strictly like suspense or like waiting, just hanging about waiting for something to happen. It gives life a permanently provisional feeling. It doesn't seem worth starting anything. It can't settle down. I yawn, I fidget, I smoke too much. Up till this, I always had too little time. Now there is nothing but time, almost pure time, empty successiveness. One flesh, or if you prefer, one ship. The starboard engine has gone. I, the port engine, must chug along somehow till we make harbor, or rather, till the journey ends. How can I assume the harbor? A lee shore, more likely, a black night, a deafening gale, breakers ahead, and any light shown from the land probably being waved by wreckers. Such was Hay's landfall, such was my mother's. I say their landfalls, not their arrivals. Chapter 3. It's not true that I'm always thinking of H. Work and conversation make that impossible, but the times when I'm not are perhaps my worst. For then, though I have forgotten the reason, there is spread over everything a vague sense of wrongness, of something amiss. Like in those dreams where nothing terrible occurs, nothing that would sound even remarkable if you told it at breakfast time. But the atmosphere, the taste of the whole thing is deadly. So with this, I see the roan berries reddening and don't know for a moment why they, of all things, should be depressing. I hear a clock strike and some quality it always had before has gone. Out of the sound. What's wrong with the world to make it so flat, shabby, worn out looking than I remember? This is one of the things I'm afraid of. The agonies, the mad midnight moments, must, in the course of nature, die away. But what will follow? Just this apathy, this dead flatness? Will there come a time when I no longer ask why the world is like a mean street? Because I shall take the squalor as normal? Does grief finally subside into boredom tinged by faint nausea? Feelings and feelings and feelings. Let me try thinking instead. From the rational point of view, what new factor has H's death introduced into the problem of the universe? What grounds has it given me for doubting all that I believe? I knew already that these things and worse happen daily. I would have said that I had taken them into account. I had warned myself not to reckon on worldly happiness. We were even promised sufferings. They were part of the program. We were even told, "Blessed are they that mourn," and I accept it. I've got nothing that I hadn't bargained for. Of course, it is different when the thing happens to oneself, not to others, and in reality, not in imagination. Yes. But should it for a sane man make quite such a difference as this? No. And it wouldn't for a man whose faith has had been real faith, and whose concern for other people's sorrows had been real concern. The case is too plain. If my house has collapsed at one blow, that is because it was a house of cards. The faith which took these things into account was not faith, but imagination. The taking them into account was not real sympathy. If I had really cared as I thought I did about the sorrows of the world, I should not have been so overwhelmed when my own sorrow came. It has been an imaginary faith playing with innocuous counters labeled illness, pain, death, and loneliness. I thought I trusted the rope until it mattered to me whether it would bear me. Now it matters, and I find I didn't. Bridge players tell me that there must be some money on the game, or else people won't take it seriously. Apparently, it's like that. Your bid for God or no God, for a good God or a cosmic sadist, for eternal life or nonentity, will not be serious if nothing much is staked on it. And you will never discover how serious it was until the stakes are raised horribly high, until you find that you are playing not for counters or for 6 pences, but for every penny you have in the world. Nothing less will shake a man, or at any rate a man like me, out of his merely verbal thinking and his merely not notional beliefs. He has to be knocked silly before he comes to his senses. Only torture will bring out the truth. Only under torture does he discover it himself. And I must surely admit, would have forced me to admit it in a few passes, that if my house was a house of cards, the sooner it was knocked down, the better. And only suffering could do it. But then the cosmic sadist and eternal vivisector comes an unnecessary hypothesis. Is this last note a sign that I'm incurable? That when reality smashes my dreams to bits, I mope and snarl while the first chalk lasts, and then patiently, idiotically start putting it together again? And so always, however often the house of cards falls, shall I set about rebuilding it? Is that what I'm doing now? Indeed. It's likely enough that what I shall call, if it happens, a restoration of faith, will turn out to be only one more house of cards, and I shan't know whether it is or not until the next blow comes. When, say, fatal disease is diagnosed in my body too, or war breaks out, or I have ruined myself by some ghastly mistake in my work. But there are two questions here. In which sense may it be a house of cards? Because the things I am believing are only a dream, or because I only dream that I believe them? As for the things themselves, why should the thoughts I had a week ago be any more trustworthy than the better thoughts I have now? I am surely in general a saner man than I was then. Why should the desperate imaginings of a man dazed, I said it was like being concussed, be especially reliable? Because there was no wishful thinking in them? Because being so horrible, they were therefore all the more likely to be true. But there are fear fulfillment as well as wish fulfillment dreams, and were they wholly dissatisfied? No. In a way, I like them. I am even aware of a slight reluctance to accept the opposite thoughts. All that stuff about the cosmic sadist was not so much the expression of thought as of hatred. I was getting from it the only pleasure a man in anguish can get, the pleasure of hitting back. It was really just Billingsgate, mere abuse, telling God what I thought of him. And of course, as in all abusive language, what I thought didn't mean what I thought true, only what I thought would offend him and his worshippers most. That sort of thing is never said without some pleasure. Gets it off your chest. You feel better for a moment, but the mood is no evidence. Of course, the cat will growl and spit at the operator and bite him if she can, but the real question is whether he is a vet or a vivisector. Her bad language throws no light on it one way or the other. And I can believe he is a vet when I think of my own suffering. It is harder when I think of hers. What is grief compared with physical pain? Whatever fools may say, the body can suffer 20 times more than the mind. The mind has always some power of evasion. At worst, the unbearable thought only comes back and back, but the physical pain can be absolutely continuous. Grief is like a bomber circling around and dropping its bombs each time the circle brings it overhead. Physical pain is like the steady barrage on a trench in World War I. Hours of it with no let-up for a moment. Thought is never static. Pain often is. What sort of a lover am I to think so much about my affliction and so much less about hers? Even the insane call "come back" is all for my own sake. I never even raised the question whether such a return, if it were possible, would be good for her. I want her back as an ingredient in the restoration of my past. Could I have wished for her anything worse? Having got once through death to come back, and then at some later date have all her dying to do over again? They call Stephen the first martyr. Hadn't Lazarus the raw deal? I begin to see my love for H was of much the same quality as my faith in God. I won't exaggerate, though. Whether there was anything but imagination in the faith, or anything but ego to egoism in the love, God knows. I don't. There may have been a little more, especially in my love for Ach, but neither was the thing I thought it was. A good deal of the card castle, but both about both. What does it matter how this grief of mine evolves, or what I do with it? What does it matter how I remember her, or whether I remember her at all? None of these alternatives will either ease or aggravate her past anguish. How do I know that all her anguish is past? I never believed before. I thought it immensely improbable that the faithfulest soul could leap straight into perfection and peace the moment death has rattled in the throat. It would be wishful thinking with a vengeance to take up that belief now. H was a splendid thing, a soul straight, bright, and tempered like a sword, but not a perfect saint. A sinful woman married to a sinful man, two of God's patients, not yet cured. I know there are not only tears to be dried, but stains to be scoured. The sword will be made even brighter. But, oh God, tenderly, tenderly, already month by month and week by week, you broke her body on the wheel whilst she still wore it. Is it not yet enough? The terrible thing is that I, a perfectly good God, is in this matter hardly less formidable than a cosmic sadist. The more we believe that God hurts only to heal, the less we believe that there is any use in begging for tenderness. A cruel man might be bribed, might grow tired of his vile sport, might have a temporary fit of mercy, as alcoholics have fits of sobriety. But suppose that what you are up against is a surgeon whose intentions are wholly good. The kinder and more conscientious he is, the more inexorably he will go on cutting. If he yielded to your entreaties, if he stopped before the operation was complete, all the pain up to that point would have been useless. But it is credible that such extremities of torture should be necessary for us. Well, take your choice. The tortures occur. If they are unnecessary, then there is no God or a bad one. If there is a good God, then these tortures are necessary, for no even moderately good being could possibly inflict or permit them if they weren't. Either way, we're for it. What do people mean when they say, "I am not afraid of God because I know He is good"? Have they never even been to a dentist? Yet this is unendurable. And then one babbles, "If only I could bear it, or the worst of it, or any of it instead of her." But one can't tell how serious that bid is, for nothing is staked on it. If it suddenly became a real possibility, then for the first time we should discover how seriously we had meant it. But is it ever allowed? It was allowed to one, we are told, and I find I can now believe again that he has done vicariously whatever can be so done. He replies to our babble, "You cannot, and you dare not," and I could and dared. Something quite unexpected has happened. It came this morning early. For various reasons, not themselves at all mysterious, my heart was lighter than it had been for many weeks. For one thing, I suppose I am recovering physically from a good deal of mere exhaustion, and I had a very tiring but very healthy 12 hours the day before, and a sounder night's sleep. And after 10 days of low-hung gray skies and motionless warm dampness, the sun was shining and there was a light breeze. And suddenly, at the very moment when, so far, I mourned age least, I remembered her best. Indeed, it was something almost better than a memory, an instantaneous, unanswerable impression. To say it was like a meeting would be going too far, yet there was that in it which tempts one to use those words. It was as if the lifting of the sorrow removed a barrier. Why has no one told me these things? How easily I might have misjudged another man in the same situation. I might have said, "He's got over it, he's forgotten his wife," when the truth was, he remembers her be better because he has partly got over it. Such was the fact, and I believe I can make sense out of it. You can't see anything properly while your eyes are blurred with tears. You can't, in most things, get what you want if you want it too desperately. Anyway, you can't get the best out of it. Now, let's have a real good talk. Reduces everyone to silence. I must get a good sleep tonight. Ushers in hours of wakefulness. Delicious drinks are wasted on a really ravenous thirst. Is it similarly the very intensity of the longing that draws the iron curtain that makes us feel we are staring into a vacuum when we think about our dead? Them as asks, at any rate, as asks to importantly don't get, perhaps can't, and so perhaps with God. I have gradually been coming to feel that the door is no longer shut and bolted. Was it my own frantic need that slammed it in my face? The time when there is nothing at all in your soul except a cry for help, maybe just the time when God can't give it. You are like the drowning man who can't be helped because he clutches and grabs. Perhaps your own reiteration cries deafen you to the voice you hope to hear. On the other hand, knock and it shall be opened. But does knocking mean hammering and kicking the door like a maniac? And there's also to him that hath shall be given. After all, you must have a capacity to receive, or even omnipotence can't give. Perhaps your own passion temporarily destroys the capacity. For all sorts of mistakes are possible when you are dealing with him. Long ago, before we were married, H was haunted all one morning as she went about her work with the obscure sense of God, so to speak, at her elbow, demanding her attention. And of course, not being a perfected saint, She had the feeling that it would be a question, as it usually is, of some unrepentant sin or tedious duty. At last, she gave in. I know how one puts it off and faced him. But the message was, I want to give you something, and instantly she entered into joy. I think I am beginning to understand why grief feels like suspense. It comes from the frustration of so many impulses that had become habitual. Thought after thought, feeling after feeling, action after action had age for their object. Now their target is gone. I keep on through habit fitting an arrow to the string, then I remember and have to lay the bow down. So many roads lead thought to H, and I set out on one of them. But now there's an impassable frontier post across it. So many roads once, now so many cols de sac. For a good wife contains so many persons in herself. What was age? Not to me. She was my daughter and my mother, my pupil and my teacher, my subject and my sovereign, and always holding all these in solution. My trusty comrade, friend, shipmate, fellow soldier, my mistress, but at the same time, all that any man friend, and I have good ones, has ever been to me, perhaps more. If we had never fallen in love, we should have nonetheless been always together and created a scandal. That's what I meant when I once praised her for her masculine virtues. But she soon put a stop to that by asking how I'd like to be praised for my feminine ones. It was a good repost, dear. Yet there was something of the Amazon, something of Penthesilea and Camilla, and you, as well as I, were glad it should be there. You were glad I should recognize it. Solomon calls his bride sister. Could a woman be a complete wife unless for a moment in one particular mood a man felt almost inclined to call her brother? It was too perfect to last, so I am tempted to say of our marriage, but it can be meant in two ways. It may be grimly pessimistic, as if God no sooner saw two of his creatures happy than he stopped it. None of that here. As if he were like the hostess at the sherry party who separates two guests the moment they show signs of having got into a real conversation. But it could also mean this had reached its proper perfection. This had become what it had in it to be. Therefore, of course, it would not be prolonged. As if God said, "Good, you have mastered that exercise. I'm very pleased with it. And now you are ready to go on to the next." When you have learned to do quadratics and enjoy doing them, you will not beset them much longer. The teacher moves you on. For we did learn and achieve something. There is hidden or flaunted a sword between the sexes till an entire marriage reconciles them. It is arrogance in us to call frankness, fairness, and chivalry masculine when we see them in a woman. It is arrogance in them to describe a man's sensitiveness, or tact, or tenderness as feminine, but also what poor warped fragments of humanity most mere men and mere women must be to make the implications of that arrogance plausible. Marriage heals this. Jointly, the two become fully human. In the image of God created he them. Thus, by a paradox, this carnival of sexuality leads us out beyond our sexes, and then one or another dies, and we think of this as love cut short, like a dance stopped in mid-career, or a flower with its head unluckily snapped off. Something truncated, and therefore lacking its due shape. I wonder if, as I can't help suspecting, the dead also feel the pains of separation, and this baby may be one of their purgatorial sufferings. Then for both lovers, and for all pairs of lovers without exception, bereavement is a universal and integral part of our experience of love. It follows marriage as normally as marriage follows courtship, or as autumn follows summer. It is not a truncation of the process, but one of its phases. Not the interruption of the dance, but the next figure. We are taken out of ourselves by the loved one while she is here. Then comes the tragic figure of the dance, in which we must learn to be still taken out of ourselves, though the bodily presence is withdrawn to love the very here, and not fall back to loving our past, or our memory, or our sorrow, or our relief from sorrow, or our own love. Looking back, I see that only a very little time ago, I was greatly concerned about my memory of H and how false it might become. For some reason, the merciful good sense of God is the only one I can think of. I have stopped bothering about that, and the remarkable thing is that since I stopped bothering about it, she seems to meet me everywhere. Meet is far too strong a word. I don't mean anything remotely like an apparition or a voice. I don't mean even any strikingly emotional experience at any particular moment. Rather, assured of unobtrusive excuse me, Rather, a sort of unobtrusive but massive sense that she is just as much as ever a fact to be taken into account. To be taken into account is perhaps an unfortunate way of putting it. It sounds as if she were rather a battle axe. How can I put it better? Would momentarily, real or abstent obstinately real do? It is as if the experience said to me, you are, as it happens, extremely glad that H is still a fact. But remember, she would be equally a fact whether you liked it or not. Your preferences have not been considered. How far have I got? Just as far, I think, as a widower of another sort who would stop leaning on his spade and say in answer to our inquiry, "Thank ye, mustn't grumble." I do miss her something dreadful, but they say these things aren't sent to try us. We have come to the same point. He with his spade and I, who am not now much good at digging with my own instrument. But of course one must take scent to try us the right way. God has not been trying an experiment on my faith or love in order to find out their quality. He knew it already. It was I who didn't. In this trial, he makes us occupy the dock, the witness box, and the bench all at once. He always knew that my temple was a house of cards, the all-the-many. His only way of making me realize the fact was to knock it down. Getting over it too soon, excuse me. Getting over it so soon? But the words are ambiguous. To say the patient is getting over it after an operation for appendicitis is one thing. After he's had his leg off is quite another. After that operation, either the wounded stump heals or the man dies. If it heals, the fierce continuous pain will stop. Presently, he'll get back his strength and be able to stump about on his wooden leg. He has got over it, but he will probably have recurrent pains in the stump all his life, and perhaps pretty bad ones. And he will always be a one-legged man. There will be hardly any moment when he forgets it. Bathing, dressing, sitting down and getting up again, even lying in bed, will all be different. His whole way of life will be changed. All sorts of pleasures and activities that he once took for granted will have to be simply written off. Duties, too. At present, I am learning to get about on crutches. Perhaps I shall presently be given a wooden leg, but I shall never be a biped again. Still, there's no denying that in some sense I feel better. And with that comes at once a sort of shame and a feeling that one is under a sort of obligation to cherish and foment and prolong one's unhappiness. I've read about that in books, but I never dreamed I should feel it myself. I am sure H wouldn't approve of it. She'd tell me not to be a fool. So I'm pretty certain, would God, what is behind it? Partly, no doubt, vanity. He won't excuse me. We want to prove to ourselves that we are lovers of the grand scale, tragic heroes, not just ordinary privates in the huge army of the bereaved, slogging along and making the best of a bad job. But that's not the whole of the explanation. I think there is also a confusion. We don't really want grief in its first agonies to be prolonged. Nobody could. But we want something else of which grief is a frequent symptom, and then we confuse the symptom with the thing itself. I wrote the other night that bereavement is not the truncation of married love, but one of its regular phases, like the honeymoon. What we want is to live our marriage well and faithfully through that phase too. If it hurts, and it certainly will, we accept the pains as a necessary part of this phase. We don't want to escape them at the price of desertion or divorce, killing the dead a second time. We were one flesh. Now that it has been cut in two, we don't want to pretend that it is whole and complete. We will be still married, still in love. Therefore, we shall still ache, but we are not at all, if we understand ourselves, seeking the aches for their own sake. The less of them the better, so long as the marriage is preserved, and the more joy there can be in the marriage between dead and living, the better. The better in every way. For as I have discovered, passionate grief does not link us with the dead but cuts us off from them. This became This become clearer and clearer. It is just at those moments when I feel least sorrow. Getting into my morning bath is usually one of them. The H rushes upon my mind in her full reality, her otherness, not as in my worst moments, all foreshortened and pathetized and solemnized by my miseries, but she is in her own right. This is good and tonic. I seem to remember, though I couldn't quote one at the moment, all sorts of ballads and folk tales in which the dead tell us that our mourning does them some kind of wrong. They beg us to stop it. There may be far more depth than this than I thought. If so, our grandfather's generation went very far astray. All that sometimes lifelong ritual of sorrow, visiting graves, keeping anniversaries, leaving the empty bedroom exactly as the departed used to keep it, mentioning the dead, either not at all or always in a special voice, or even like Queen Victoria, having the dead man's clothes put out for dinner every evening. This was like mummification. It made the dead far more dead. Or was that, unconsciously, its purpose? Something very primitive may be at work here. To keep the dead thoroughly dead, to make sure that they won't come sliding back among the living, is a main preoccupation of the savage mind. At all cost, make them stay put. Certainly, these rituals do in fact empathize their deadness. Perhaps this result was not really so unwelcome, not always as the ritualists believed. But I have no business to judge them. All guesswork. I'd better keep my breath to cool my own porridge. For me, at any rate, this program is plain. I will turn to her as often as possible in the gladness. I will even salute her with a laugh. The less I mourn her, the nearer I seem to her. An admirable program. Unfortunately, it can't be carried out. Tonight, all the hells of young grief have opened again, and the mad words, the bitter resentment, the fluttering in the stomach, the nightmare unreality, the wallowed in tears, for in grief nothing stays put. One keeps on emerging from a phase, but it always reoccurs round and round. Everything repeats. Am I going in circles, or do I hope I am on a spiral? But if a spiral, am I going up or down it? How often will it be for always? How often will the vast emptiness astonish me like a complete novelty and make me say, I never realized my loss till this moment? The same leg is cut off time after time. The first plunge of the knife into the flesh is felt again and again. They say the coward dies many times, so does the beloved. Didn't the eagle find a fresh liver to tear in Prometheus every time it died? Chapter 4. This is the fourth and the last empty MS book I can find in the house, at least nearly empty, for there are some pages of very ancient arithmetic at the end by J. I resolved to let this limit my jottings. I will not start buying books for the purpose, insofar as this record was a defense against total collapse. A safety valve. It has done some good. The other end I had in view turns out to have been based on a misunderstanding. I thought I could describe a state, make a map of sorrow. Sorrow, however, turns out to be not a state, but a process. It needs not a map, but a history. And if I don't stop writing that history at some quite arbitrary point, there's no reason why I should ever stop. There is something new to be chronicled every day. Grief is like a long valley, a winding valley where any bend may reveal a totally new landscape. As I've already noted, not every bend does. Sometimes the surprise is the opposite one. You are presented with exactly the same sort of country you thought you had left behind miles ago. That is when you wonder whether the valley isn't a circular trench, but it isn't. There are partial recurrences, but the sequence doesn't repeat. Here, for instance, is a new phase, a new loss. I do all the walking I can, for I'd be a fool to go to bed not tired. Today I have been revisiting old haunts, taking one of the long rambles that made me so happy in my bachelor days. And this time, the face of nature was not emptied of its beauty, and the world didn't look, as I complained some days ago, like a mean street. On the contrary, every horizon, every stile or clump of trees summoned me into a past kind of happiness, my pre-age happiness. But the invitation seemed to me horrible. The happiness into which it invited me was insipid. I find that I don't want to go back again and be happy in that way. It frightens me to think that a mere going back should even be possible. For this fate would seem to me the worst of all, to reach a state in which my years of love and marriage should appear in retrospect, a charming episode, like a holiday, that had briefly interrupted my interminable life and returned me to normal unchanged. And then it would come to seem unreal. Something so foreign to the usual texture of my history that I could almost believe it had happened to someone else. Thus, H would die to me a second time, a worse bereavement than the first. Anything but that. Did you ever know, dear, how much you took away with you when you left? You have stripped me even of my past, even of the things we never shared. I was wrong to say the stump wasn't recovering from the pain of the amputation. I was deceived because it has so many ways to hurt me that I discover them only one by one. Still, there are the two enormous gains. I know myself too well now to call them lasting. Turn to God. My mind no longer meets that locked door. Turn to H. It no longer meets that vacuum, nor all that fuss about my mental image of her. My jotting shows something of the process, but not so much as I'd hoped. Perhaps both changes were really not observable. There was no sudden striking and emotional transition, like the warming of a room or the coming of daylight. When you first notice them, they have already been going on for some time. The notes have been about myself and about H and about God in that order. The order and the proportions exactly what they ought not to have been. And I see that I have nowhere fallen into that mode of thinking about either, which we call praising them. Yet that would have been best for me. Praise is the mode of love which always has some element of joy in it. Praise in due order of him as the giver or her as the gift. Don't we in praise somehow enjoy what we praise, however far we are from it? I must do more of this. I have lost the fruition I once had of age, and I am far, far away in the valley of my unlikeness from the fruition which, if his mercies are infinite, I may sometime have of God. But by praising, I can still, in some degree, enjoy her, and already, in some degree, enjoy him better than nothing. But perhaps I lack the gift. I see I've described H as being a sword. That's true as far as it goes, but utterly inadequate by itself and misleading. I ought to have balanced it. I ought to have said, but also like a garden, like a nest of gardens. Wall within wall, hedge within hedge, more secret, more full of fragrant and fertile life, the further you entered. And then of her and of every created thing I praise, I should say in some way, in its unique way, like him who made it. Thus up from the garden to the gardener, from the sword to the smith, to the life-giving life and the beauty that makes beautiful. She is in God's hands. That gains a new energy when I think of her as a sword. Perhaps the earthly life I shared with her was only part of the tempering. Now perhaps he grasps the hilt, weighs the new weapon, makes lightnings with it in the air, a new Jerusalem blade. One moment last night can be described in similes. Otherwise, it won't go into language at all. Imagine a man in total darkness. He thinks he is in a cellar or dungeon. Then there comes a sound. He thinks it might be a sound from far off, waves or wind-blown trees or cattle half a mile away. And if so, it proves he's not in a cellar, but free in the open air. Or it may be a much smaller sound close at hand, a chuckle of laughter, and if so, there is a friend just beside him in the dark. Either way, a good sound. I am not mad enough to take such an experience as evidence for anything. It is simply the leaping into imaginative activity of an idea, which I would always have theoretically admitted. The idea that I or any mortal at any time may be utterly mistaken as to the situation he is really in. 5 senses, an incurably abstract intellect, a haphazardly selective memory, a set of preconceptions, and assumptions so numerous that I can never examine more than a minority of them, never become even conscious of them all. How much of total reality can such an apparatus let through? I will not, if I can help it, shin up either the feathery or the prickly tree. 2 widely different convictions press more and more on my mind. One is that the eternal vet is even more inexorable, and the possible operations even more painful than our severest imaginings can forebode. But the other, that all shall be well, and all should be well, and all manner of things shall be well. It doesn't matter that all the photographs of H are bad. It doesn't matter not much if my memory of her is imperfect. Images, whether on paper or in the mind, are not important for themselves, merely links. Take a parallel from an infinitely higher sphere. Tomorrow morning, a priest will give me a little round, thin, cold, tasteless wafer. Is it a disadvantage? Is it not in some ways an advantage that it can't pretend the least resemblance to that with which it unites me? I need Christ, not something that resembles him. I want H, not something that is like her. A really good photograph might become in the end a snare, a horror, an obstacle. Images, I must suppose, have their use or they would not have been so popular. It makes little difference whether they are pictures and statuses outside the mind or imaginative constructions within it. To me, however, their danger is more obvious. Images of the holy easily become holy images. Satra Sanct, my idea of God is not a divine idea. It has to be shattered time after time. He shatters it himself. He is the great iconoclast. Could we not almost say that this shattering is one of the marks of his presence? The incarnation is the supreme example. It leaves all previous ideas of the Messiah in ruins, and most are offended by the iconoclasm. And blessed are those who are not. But the same thing happens in our private prayers. All reality is iconoclastic. The earthly beloved, even in this life, incessantly triumphs over your mere idea of her, and you want her to. You want her with all her resistances, all her faults, all her unexpectedness that is in her foursquare and independent reality. And this, not any image or memory, is what we are to love still after she is dead. But this is not now imaginable. In that respect, H and all the dead are like God. In that respect, loving her has become in its measure like loving him. In both cases, I must stretch out the arms and hands of love. Its eyes cannot here be used to the reality through across all the changeful phantasmagoria of my thoughts, passions, and imaginings. I mustn't sit down content with the phantasmagoria itself and worship that for him or love that for her. Not my idea of God, but God. Not my idea of H, but H. Yes. And also not my idea of my neighbor, but my neighbor. For don't we often make this mistake, as regards people who are still alive, who are with us in the same room, talking and acting not to the man himself, but to the picture, almost the precise we've made of him in our own minds, and he has to depart from it pretty widely before we even notice the fact. In real life, that's one way it differs from the novels. His words and acts are, if we observe closely, hardly ever quite in character. That is, in what we call his character. There's always a card in his hand we didn't know about. My reason for assuming that I do this to other people is the fact that so often I find them obviously doing it to me. We all think we've got one another tapped, and all this time I may once more be building with cards, and if I am, he will once more knock the building flat. He will knock it down as often as proves necessary, unless I have to be finally given up as hopeless and left building pasteboard palaces in hell forever, free among the dead. Am I, for instance, just sidling back to God because I know that if there's any road to H, it runs through him? But then, of course, I know perfectly well that he can't be used as a road. If you're approaching him not as the goal but as a road, not as the end but as a means, you're not really approaching him at all. That's what was really wrong with all those popular pictures of happy reunions on the further shore. Not the simple-minded and very earthly images, but the fact that they make an end of what we can get only as a byproduct of the true end. Lord, are these your real terms? Can I meet age again only if I learn to love you so much that I don't care whether I meet her or not? Consider, Lord, how it looks to us. What would anyone think of me if I said to the boys, "No toffee now"? But when you've grown up and don't really want toffee, you shall have as much of it as you choose. If I knew that to be eternally divided from H and eternally forgotten by her would add a greater joy and splendor to her being, of course, I'd say, fire ahead. Just as if on earth I could have cured her by cancer, just as if on earth I could have cured her cancer by never seeing her again. I'd have arranged never to see her again. I'd have had to. Any decent person would. But that's quite different. That's not the situation I'm in. When I lay these questions before God, I get no answer, but a rather special sort of no answer. It is not the locked door. It's more like a silent, certainly not uncompassionate gaze, as though he shook his head not in refusal, but waving the question like, "Peace, child, you don't understand." Can a mortal ask questions which God finds unanswerable? Quite easily, I should think. All nonsense questions are unanswerable. How many hours are there in a mile? Is yellow square or round? Probably half the questions we ask, half our great theological and metaphysical problems are like that. And now that I come to think of it, there's no practical problem before me at all. I know the great commandments, and I'd better get on with them. Indeed, H's death has ended the practical problem. While she was still alive, I could, in practice, have put her before God. That is, I could have done what she wanted instead of what he wanted. If there'd been a conflict, what's left is not a problem about anything I could do. It's all about weights of feelings and motives and that sort of thing. It's a problem setting myself. I don't believe God set at me at all. The fruition of God, reunion with the dead, these can't figure in my thinking except as counters, blank checks. My idea, if you can call it an idea, of the fire of the first is a huge, risky extrapolation from a very few and short experiences here on Earth. Probably not such valuable experiences, I think, perhaps even of less value than others that I take no account of. My idea of the second is also an extrapolation. The reality of either, the cashing of either check, would probably blow all one's ideas about both. How much more one's ideas about their relations to each other into smithereens. The mystical union on the one hand, the resurrection of the body on the other. I can't reach the ghost of an image, a formula, or even a feeling that combines them, but the reality we are given to understand does. Reality, the iconoclast, but the reality, the iconoclast once more. Heaven will solve our problems, but not, I think, by showing us subtle reconciliations between all our apparently contradictory notions. The notions will all be knocked from under our feet. We shall see that there never was any problem. And more than once, that impression which I can't describe except by saying that it's like the sound of a chuckle in the darkness. The sense that some shattering and disarming simplicity is the real answer. It is often thought that the dead see us, and we assume whether reasonably or not, that if they see us at all, they see us more clearly than before. Does H now see exactly how much froth or tinsel there was in what she called "and I call my love"? So be it. Look your hardest, dear. I won't hide if I could. We didn't realize each other. We tried to keep no secrets. You knew most of the rotten places in me already. If you now see anything worse, I can take it, so can you. Rebuke, explain, mock, forgive, for this is one of the miracles of love. It gives to both, but perhaps especially to the woman, a power of seeing through its own enchantments and yet not being disenchanted. To see in some measure like God, his love and his knowledge are not distinct from one another nor from him. We could almost say he sees because he loves and therefore loves although he sees. Sometimes, Lord, one is tempted to say that if you wanted us to behave like the lilies of the field, you might have given us an organization more like theirs. But that, I suppose, is just your grand experiment. Or no, not an experiment, for you have no need to find things out. Rather, your grand enterprise. To make an organism which is also a spirit, to make that terrible oxymoron a spiritual animal, to take a poor primate, a beast with nerve endings all over it, a creature with a stomach that wants to be filled, a breeding animal that wants its mate, and say, now get on with it. Become a god. I said several notebooks ago that even if I got what seemed like an assurance of H's presence, I wouldn't believe it. Easier said than done. Even now, though, I won't treat anything of that sort as evidence. It's the quality of last night's experience, not what it proves, but what it was that makes it worth putting down. It was quite incredibly unemotional. Just the impression of her mind momentarily facing my own. Mind not soul, as we tend to think of soul. Certainly the reverse of what is called soulful. Not at all like a rapturous reunion of lovers. Much more like getting a telephone call or a wire from her about some practical arrangement. Not that there was any message, just intelligence and attention. No sense of joy or sorrow. No love even in our ordinary sense. No unlove. I had never in any mood imagined the dead as being so businesslike. Yet there was an extreme and cheerful intimacy. An intimacy that had not passed through the senses or the emotions at all. If this was a throw-up from my unconscious, then my unconscious must be a far more interesting region than the depth psychologists have led me to expect. For one thing, it is apparently much less primitive than my consciousness. Whether it came from, it has made a sort of spring cleaning in my mind. The dead could be like that. Sheer intellects. A Greek philosopher wouldn't have been surprised at an experience like mine. He would have expected that if anything of us remained after death, it would be just that. Up to now, this always seemed to me a most arid and chilling idea. The absence of emotion repelled me, but in this contact, whether real or apparent, it didn't do anything of the sort. One didn't need emotion. The intimacy was complete, sharply bracing and restorative too without it. Can that intimacy be love itself? Always in this life attended with emotion, not because it is itself an emotion or needs an attendant emotion, but because our animal souls, our nervous systems, our imaginations have to respond to it in that way. If so, how many preconceptions I must scrap? A society, A communion of pure intelligences would not be cold, drab, and comfortless. On the other hand, it wouldn't be very like what people usually mean when they use such words as spiritual or mystical or holy. It would, if I have had a glimpse, be, well, I'm almost scared at the adjectives I'd have to use. Brisk, cheerful, keen, alert, intense, wide awake, above all solid, utterly reliable, firm. There is no nonsense about the dead. When I say intellect, I include will. Attention is an act of will. Intelligence in action is will par excellence. What seemed to meet me was full of resolution. Once, very near the end, I said, "If you can, if it is allowed, come to me when I too am on my deathbed." Out loud, she said. Heaven would have a job to hold me, and as for hell, I'd break it into bits. She knew she was speaking a kind of mythological language with even an element of comedy in it. There was a twinkle as well as a tear in her eye, but there was no myth and no joke about the will deeper than any feeling that flashed through her. But I mustn't, because I have come to misunderstand a little less completely what a pure intelligence might be, lean over too far. There is also, whatever it means, the resurrection of the body. We cannot understand. The best is perhaps what we understand least. Didn't people dispute once whether the final vision of God was more an act of intelligence or of love? That is probably another of the nonsense questions. How wicked it would be if we could to call the dead back. She said, not to me, but to the chaplain, "I am at peace with God." She smiled, but not at me. Fontana.